Hello and welcome to News Club. I'm your host Em, and this is where we talk about the news and what to do about it. Today I'm joined by Debs, Tom and Secret, all fantastic people with fantastic thoughts, ideas and news to bring to you. They've all spoken on our podcast before, and that reminds me to remind you that you should definitely check out all the episodes. They're out now. We've had fantastic discussions, brilliant insights, definitely something you don't want to be missing. And stick around for today because we will be delving into collective non-payment as a tactic. What does it mean to take back our water, to recreate the commons? After a break, we'll get into the media blitzkrieg. What that is, what that looks like, fucking media hygiene, and the fact that we really have to get on that. And once again, we'll have another break before we're joined by Chivers towards the end, who, I say that as though he's not already here, but he will end the episode by talking on the Birmingham bin strikes and, striking, all of that. What the fuck is happening? But let's get into it. So, Debs, how are we taking back our water?
Yeah, so the thing I wanted to talk about today is a campaign that I think has just launched because it says on its website from the 1st of April. So I think it's just started. It's called Take Back Our Water. And it's basically trying to get people to say that they're not going to pay their water bills because we're seeing massive price hikes, average price hikes of around 30%. I don't know about you, but my bill's gone up from like 600 a year to 800 a year. And this is in a context where the private water companies that provide water to our houses are not doing the absolute basics. They are pumping sewage into our rivers. They're giving an incredibly bad service. There's obviously been a lot of coverage of this, but just some like little statistics from a campaign called Surfers Against Sewage. In 2023, there were over 600,000 discharges of raw sewage into the UK waterways, and 75% of UK rivers pose a serious risk to human health. So this is clearly a really unacceptable situation. And then at the same time, these companies are asking us to pay more for water, which is obviously like an essential thing for life. And really, this is like the story of what's been going on in our water system is the story of privatisation. We used to have water provided by public companies, and they were privatized under Margaret Thatcher. And the idea with that was that the story that they said at the time was that they would become more democratic because people would become shareholders. And then as shareholders, they would hold the companies to account, or they would ensure a good service. But that's not what's happened. They've ended up being owned by, massive hedge funds and these really big corporations who've sucked billions and billions of pounds out of them and given them out as like shareholder dividends to people who are already very wealthy. And then they haven't invested in the infrastructure. So part of the reason that we're seeing so many of these sewage discharges is because, the infrastructure is just kind of creaking, like the pipes are not functioning well. They need a massive overhaul. And also our weather systems are changing because of a little thing called climate change. So as you will have noticed, we keep having like the wettest May on record, followed by the driest June and then the wettest July. And this kind of pattern of surging water means that you actually need a better infrastructure to deal with it. So often when they're putting sewage into the rivers, it's because they haven't built an infrastructure that can deal with the kind of like heavy rainfall that we're having now. And so, I guess I wanted to talk about this campaign, Take Back Water, because obviously this is like awful. It's awful that we're basically being asked to pay for it as well. And what this campaign is doing is asking people to pledge to not pay their water bills. They've had nearly 10,000 people sign up so far. And this is kind of part of a tactic which has been used at various times of like getting a big group of people to say, we're not going to pay altogether. Because if one person just doesn't pay, then their water might get cut off, or they might, get pursued through the courts or whatever. But if like a million people don't pay, suddenly you're kind of protected because there's so many people around you. It'd be very difficult to take action against all of those people at once. And we do have examples in history of when this has worked. On the Take Back Water website, they talk about the poll tax, which was basically a change that happened. It was proposed under Thatcher in like 1989, 1990, for what eventually became council tax. And they were going to do it as the poll tax. It was going to be a flat rate for every person. So this obviously would mean that richer people would end up actually kind of paying less. It was very, very unpopular, and there were lots of different things that happened around that. There were big protests, there were riots, but also there was a campaign of non-payment. And lots of people were like, well, I'm just not going to pay this charge when it comes in. And actually, the riots are the things that are often talked about and often remembered, but the non-payment was the thing that really showed how much support the rioters had, and how this was actually just a genuinely very, very unpopular thing. And it was basically the thing that led to Margaret Thatcher stopping being Prime Minister, being sort of kicked out. And then when John Major came in, he changed the poll tax. We've had more recent examples of people trying to use this tactic. I have this memory that, like, before Extinction Rebellion, I think the Rising Up, the thing which was like pre-Extinction Rebellion, I think they had a whole idea of like getting people to pledge to do something, but only if a certain number of people would do it. We've also had this Don't Pay campaign a couple of years ago around energy bills, when all the energy bills the prices were being hiked. And again, that was okay, if 1 million people sign up to this, then we will all do a mass non-payment. I think they had 200,000 people sign up, and then actually there were some changes in the support that was being given and the price cap and stuff. So it didn't go ahead, but it did show kind of something of the strength of feeling. I actually think collective non-payment with water might be more successful than with energy, because basically because the water companies are in a more precarious situation. Like, actually, these companies are very, very laden with debts. And so not receiving money from customers, from a large number of customers, could actually be something which has a really big financial impact on them and leads to them going to the government and saying, we need your help. So it could actually be a route towards taking it back into public ownership. But I also think that maybe it's something that needs to be combined in the way the poll tax riots and protests all combined with this non-payment. It might need to be combined with some other tactics, which are a bit more about just really like raising the profile of it, doing something a bit more kind of spectacular and attention grabbing. Because although we have had news coverage of the state of our rivers and seas, and there hasn't been this kind of, it's not like a sustained media story. So doing some things which could sort of put it on the agenda more consistently might be something that makes this like a more successful campaign.
I'm quite curious also actually about how the privatised infrastructure that we have presently in England, how that differs from Scotland, because it's not to say that just because it's in public ownership, it's necessarily like the best approach to how we manage water and take back our water. What's the difference really between public and private, and how do we go beyond that?
Well, I think that's a really good point, and it is definitely true that some of the criticisms that people had of public bodies in like the 70s and 80s, they had a truth to them. The thing is that the private version that we've got since then has not been better, it's been worse. But I think there's a campaign group called We Own It, and they talk a lot about 21st century public services. They talk about actually needing to create these other kinds of models where, yeah, it's not just like the state is doing this thing for you, but actually you have much more kind of public involvement and participation, and people actually getting to be part of decision making around, how you want to invest your money, what your priorities are. Imagine if people, in South Yorkshire where I live, Yorkshire Water wasn't just either this private company or run by the state, but actually people in Yorkshire could like elect people to a body that would then make decisions but also communicate with people, and then we could actually be trying to deal, because some of these things, they are genuinely difficult problems. Like, we don't actually really know very well how to deal with the patterns of rainfall that we're having here. So we're actually going to need, I think, to be a lot more creative and maybe to be learning from other places in the world where this is what their rainfall has always been like. So maybe they know what to do about it. So yeah, I do think that like thinking beyond just going back into public ownership is absolutely right. And there is some really interesting thinking about how to do that.
I was going to just add to that. I think the thing that's also really tricky with our water companies, I mean, I don't really think that privatization of any of these things works well because the whole competition myth. But with what we have in England at the moment, we have private companies, but the whole purpose of this kind of free marketplace is that you're supposed to have competition. And with water companies, there is no competition. You don't have the option. Again, don't like privatization, but I think an example of something where you can see that there is some sort of flexibility is like energy bills at the moment. We have private energy companies, but they have the choice of green tariffs. We also have things like community energy coming in different councils, especially up in the north. You've got community-owned solar panels and wind farms. So there's been this kind of shift into people owning their own energy, but also having that flexibility to switch to things that they prefer. Whereas I have United Utilities here in Manchester, horror show. You can't contact them. There's no way to even go through customer service. I was just looking at, there's a site called boycottwaterbills.com, which actually has some more specific instructions as to how to go through the process of cancelling your water bill and how to protect yourself as well. So that might be a good thing to share alongside it. Obviously, a lot of people don't want to pledge to cancel, also don't want everyone to get bailiffs around. So there's a few steps that people can take to protect themselves with that as well.
Am I correct in saying that during what I'll call the poll tax rebellion, on a pragmatic level, it was very difficult to actually just chase people? And the kind of tactics that were adopted to essentially kind of overwhelm the state and its agents to definitely make it difficult for people to essentially get chased up on. What did that look like, and how might we see that present day?
I mean, you're definitely challenging the level of detail of what it was like in 1989 to pay your bills. I mean, I was 5, so I wasn't really thinking about it,
And you weren't taking action.
I know.
Absolutely
Your
ridiculous.
silence was deafening.
But you're absolutely right that, like, we obviously have a really different relationship with the state in terms of, like, just how much they know about us, how easily they can track us down. I think there were a set of ways that people could, but at the same time, we also have different ways of being able to communicate with each other. And in so many ways, it's just incredible with the poll tax that there was this, that people they got the word out. Because, I'm assuming that, for example, the mainstream newspapers were not on board with this. They were not putting the word out and saying, here's step-by-step instructions for not paying your rates. So yeah, I guess it's also a sign. I think it's always good to remember that activist movements and kind of forms of resistance and rebellion, they did know how to talk to each other and get ideas around before the internet existed. But what we can do now, I think, is actually react much more quickly and assemble large groups of people to take action together. And I think what you're saying is that there is a level of risk to this. Like, you could end up having, it could affect your credit rating. It could be something that potentially you end up going through court systems for. And I suppose that's also why the scale of the thing is really important. 10,000 people is probably not enough for it to be effective, but 200,000 people would probably make a big difference.
The whole point of collective action, right? It's like not the Area 51 raid, they can't stop all of us. But considering how poor they are at responding to anything that you have as an issue when you're an actual customer, I think there's good hope in having a lot of people not paying at the same time.
What about you, Chivers? What were you doing back in the day?
Not being born yet is what I wasn't doing. But I know from my parents who went to the big poll tax marches in London, the ones that eventually devolved in, you've got the old TV footage of the police vans going down the streets and people, turned into a really huge, in places, violent act of civil disobedience and mass collective action. I think what the crucial difference with poll tax resistance was that it was much easier back then because it was levied on individual people. It was easy to just say, well, prove I live here. Prove that this house has so many people in it, and therefore the poll tax needs to be, there are 5 people in this house, or there is 1 person in this house. So if you can imagine a society when there wasn't a massive data chain of everywhere you've lived and everyone who lives there, and how to track you down and how to take your money and how to block your accounts. Obviously, things are very different today, and I think that's part of what makes the resistance and rebellion around water extra difficult, but also even more important, is because, it's really scary for when you think about what people are cutting back on in a cost of living crisis. They start off with, the silly basics like coffees and trips out. Then they start turning the heating down. Then they start buying less food. And really, it tends to be sort of water and rent are the last 2 to go, because then it's like, okay, well, now I'm just living in a kind of Neolithic setting where I don't have food, warmth, or shelter. So
okay, let's not cast aspersions on the Neolithic. People had access to water in the Neolithic.
For tens of thousands of years, they had some kind of functioning society. So something worked back then. I don't know quite what, because I wasn't born then either. I wasn't alive in the poll tax riots, and I wasn't alive for Neolithic period. So I'll leave representatives from that period to make their own case. I think what's really interesting also about the water stuff is, it's coming to that point of can't pay, won't pay. and the scale of costs and hardship that people are facing, and the way that the rising tide of the cost of living crisis is, drowning more and more people. It used to just be it's the really, really vulnerable who are suffering from this, and now it's people who were otherwise relatively comfortable or felt that they were stable in paying their bills. I think what's also interesting is the way that the connections between things like how privatisation of water has failed, the sewage being pumped into our water systems, the massive bonuses that are paid out to these companies in a sense of people are getting still millions and millions of pounds of bonuses for running companies that are failing. And the best the Labour government can do is say, well, we'll ban bonuses if they're not doing good enough. Like, if they still keep polluting the waters, then maybe they don't get their bonuses. Rather than a sense of maybe there shouldn't be bonuses at all for people running a water company. Maybe privatisation and competition in water isn't something that should be rewarded. Maybe that money could be going somewhere else. I don't know. I don't run water companies, but that feels like a better way to run things. So it's just that sense that when the issue of water bills may be when finally, ironically, the dam bursts right on the cost of living crisis, where people recognise this is just something I can't afford to pay. It's absolutely scandalous what's going on with my money, what privatisation has done, what ecological damage is doing, the fact I can't pay for it. So there's a really interesting sense of the way that the overlapping publicity around what's happening with the water companies could be far more effective and more helpful to these kind of collective resistance campaigns than we may have seen in other spaces.
So how are we going to do it, guys? How are we going to pledge? What should we do? What are the next steps?
Well, I mean, on the Take Back Water website, you can pledge and you can add your name. Obviously, Sneakerut was just saying if you want to actually see the steps towards it, you can go on, what was it called? Boycott Water Bills.
Boycottwaterbills.com. Yes, they have a 9-step process.
Amazing. What is the process? What are the 9 steps?
Oh my God, they're quite long. Well, it's about making sure that you're covered in writing about different parts. So one of the things that they suggest on here is you cancel your payment, but you then go through the process. Basically, water companies have, it's going to get really in depth. Water companies have 2 aspects to their bill. One is the water they provide to you. The other part is wastewater. And the wastewater and the sewage is what we're continuing to pay more and more of because they keep polluting everything. So cancel your direct debit. Then make a complaint to your water company. They have a template on the website. You can tell them that you cancelled the direct debit. You can ask for your bills to be issued by post with how much you're being charged for incoming water, how much you're being charged for wastewater, which means that they can't pursue for debt collection whilst you have an open bill outstanding. Then the water company is legally obligated to respond within 10 days. If you're not satisfied, you can inform the water company that you want to take it to the Consumer Council of Water, otherwise known as the CCW. Then if you're not satisfied with that response, you're entitled to apply for adjudication to the Dispute Resolution Ombudsman, which is a recent thing that's just happened. And then if you're not satisfied with that, you can complain to Offwater, Ofwat. And then at the end of the process, if you feel obligated to pay, you can pay, or you can continue to boycott or start the entire process all over again. But doing this over the course of a couple of months, whilst more and more people are boycotting as well, that's a large period of time for them to have no money coming in at the same time.
Fantastic.
Like you say, it's kind of playing them at their own game of we know how terrible their customer service is. We know how terrible it is to try and communicate with them about anything. When you need something, they will not communicate with you. So now you're like, well, okay, let's see how long it takes you to pursue this thing about me not paying my bill. And let's see how long it takes you if you also are trying to do that with 20,000 other people in my area at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's core to a lot of these things is so much of the kind of brutalizing and punishing bureaucracy that goes around things like debt collection or unpaid bills or county court judgments and all these little bits and pieces that exist to scare you into paying for things you can't afford. It is that overwhelming the system they've tried to create to scare you into paying bills, I think, is what's core of this campaign. And possibly what needs to be part of the sort of the way we talk to other people, encouraging them to get involved, is not go into your back garden and turn off the water lever and sit there until someone nationalizes water. It's about exposing the massive failed systems that have been put in place to try and direct you into paying for a service that isn't doing a public good and is exploiting your basic need for water. Yeah, I mean, more power to this campaign, and I will be looking into signing up. I'm in a weird position where, because I live in a block of flats, my water bill is tied to my service charge, so I don't have a direct connection with how much water I'm using, which on a basic consumer level is good because I can just keep the taps running all day, every day, waste hundreds of litres of water for no purpose.
Don't you do wastewater as well?
I was actually thinking about this, like, from my understanding, like, in Scotland, people use more water but pay less than people in England. Like, how do you encourage a culture of people not wasting water? Because, like, on a personal domestic level, I'm terrified of wasting water. Like, I grew up in that turn all the lights off, really, when you brush your teeth, you do not leave the tap running. You use the water, you know what I mean? Because you kind of have that, like, third world mentality. Not to be politically incorrect or anything, but...
It's a responsible mentality.
None of us three are going to correct you on that.
You're just reclaiming it. It was a radical term.
None of us are going to step in and go, actually.
But yeah, I guess, like, because on a personal level I have that mentality, but then I obviously can appreciate that that's not how a lot of people live. So where do we coincide here with this desire to, like, on the individual level to a certain extent be mindful, but also, like, really hold to account the fact that that is incomparable to the wastage and the sewage and the horrific polluting of our own country, planet.
It's difficult, is because, like, what we've seen increasingly from energy and water companies is they adopt that same language. Right, they're saying, "Oh, really sorry, we have to raise your bills. There's nothing we can do about it. But you can do something by cutting down on how much you use your heating or not running the tap while you're brushing your teeth." And it's like, well, yeah, those are responsible things to do in a grand sense of why would you waste stuff that's costing you money and is a, valuable ecological resource, but also not. It's very, very difficult to not accept that sort of greenwashing, water washing PR from the companies themselves, while also realizing I should be doing that anyway.
Yeah.
Again, it's about kind of changing the way we talk about them away from being a service, like a private commodity that we're buying into and we have to be responsible about it, to just always asserting these are things that are essential to our lives. They're public resources that should belong to all of us, and the responsibility has to go hand in hand with not being exploited.
Yeah, and more than just being like talking about it as a public resource, it's a commons. It falls literally everywhere, and then and it is essential to life, and it's not just essential to humans, it is essential to all of the life around us. And what we've seen is this process of enclosure where someone has said, oh, here's this thing which you were in relationship with before, right? Like it wasn't just this thing, it wasn't just a resource, right? It was like a thing that's like you take care of it because you understand that it is the basis of life. And then someone else is like, okay, now this is a commodity and I'm going to put a fence around it and I'm going to make you pay for it. And now your relationship to that responsibility is just in terms of like, well, how much money do you have? And so, yeah, I think for me, when we own it, talk about this kind of creating these new structures for governance, that also implies like a different relationship that people have, where you're then thinking, not wasting water in the sense of I understand that this thing is precious and I understand that it needs to be shared, and I understand that especially with the changing weather, like we have to be really careful about how we're sharing this thing, and also not just with the humans but with the non-humans that also rely on it. And that's what commons is.
My first thought was aliens. Sounds like, you're right. It's collective ownership. When you own it collectively, then you have a responsibility to look after it collectively. But what you have at the minute is people charging you out the arse for things and then telling you not to be so wasteful. It's like being told to be thrifty in a situation where you've robbed me. So it definitely feels like it's not the tone that you want to be focusing on at the moment, I guess.
So let's recreate the commons. I love it.